From the previous lesson, I still have the sphere here. If you don't have that, I can just delete that, and we can go up here to this polygon sphere and click that. You can also get to it by going to Create, Polygon Primitives, and Sphere. One other thing that's kind of fun with these menus is you can actually tear them off. So you can see there's this little option here. If I hover my mouse just above this, and most menus have this one has it, most all of these menus have this little option here. So if I knew I was going to make a lot of primitives, a lot of spheres or something, just as an example, I can just click that and I'll have this kind of menu torn off. So now I can just click this a bunch of times, and if I open up my outliner, Windows Outliner, I can see I made a bunch of spheres. We only need one, so I'm going to shift select all of those below it and hit delete. And I'll select the sphere here. I'm also going to click and drag this outliner and let it hover here and let go so it'll kind of dock it in the window here. I'm going to close this menu that I had hovering, and know I can get back to it, up here if I want. Now that we have the sphere, you can see that there's these kind of squares and different things going on here. So let's take a look. The way that we manipulate things in Maya is basically through several different tools. One of which is, you may have already seen, by hitting Q you can get to the select tool, or you can select it up here. It's just the cursor option. I can select the object here just by left mouse clicking. I can also select it from the outliner here. So we've got the object selected, but now I want to move it. How do I move it? I can hit W on my keyboard to pull up the shortcut for the manipulator. I can also select it over here. You can see the move tool is what the tooltip says, and you can see as well that in parentheses it says W. So we can also see the shortcut is listed there. So now with the sphere selected, and if you can notice, even with the move tool selected, I can select different objects. You don't always have to have the select tool selected to select new things. You can have the move tool selected and you can still select stuff. So you can also click and drag to select things in a group. So now that we have this one thing, let's move it around. I can click any axis and it'll be isolated to that axis. I'll undo that, and you can see it's isolated because the axes manipulator turned yellow. If I click the vertical one, it turns yellow, or the z-axis, it also turns yellow. So now I know, no matter if my mouse is going up and down or something weird, that it's only going to go along that axis. But if I want to have a free movement, I can just click in the middle and move the thing around wherever I want it. The other thing I can do is isolate on two axes, and that's what these little squares are here, that I can, know I'm only moving it in the vertical and x-axis. I use these quite a bit actually, because in 3D space it's hard to tell where you're moving something sometimes. So it's hard to tell if that's actually vertically up or if I moved it back in space. So by selecting these, you can tell that I'm not moving it up. I'm moving it in the x and the z on this flat plane, this grid. And if you can't see this grid for some reason, if it didn't default to that, you can also turn that on here or turn it off if it's distracting. That's just one of these little options up here. So now that we know how to move things around, let's rotate it. So we can hit E on the keyboard, and similarly we can find it over here in this little toolbox window. And you can actually turn off these options from Windows, UI elements, and you can turn off the toolbox. Now you can see that disappears. If you find yourself not using those, it's nice to turn them off and you have more screen real estate for the viewport. But for now, since we're all beginners and we're just starting out, let's leave that up. So I'll go back to the UI elements, meaning user interface, and I'll go down to toolbox and bring that back. So with the rotation, it's very similar, that we can isolate different axes and they turn yellow, and we can click in the middle here and have a freeform option. One thing to keep in mind is, because we're working in 3D, watch the x-axis. If I click the z-axis and drag the red one down, now the red one is where the green one used to be. Did you see that? So I just undid it. So right now the green one is kind of going around, and if I bring the x-axis, the red one, down, now that's replaced it. So who's to say which axis is which now? Because before I rotated it, the green one was down here, the y-axis. But now because I rotated z, the x-axis is down here. So this option, this kind of view that we're seeing, is based on the object, right? Because the object is rotating, the axes are changing. And that's something very important to keep in mind, because that'll be important later in animation and stuff. So just keep that in mind, that because now we're in 3D, these things actually kind of matter. And we can control them in different ways. If we hold down E, which is the shortcut for rotation, if we hold down E on our keyboard and then click, left mouse click, we can drag to the world option. So now you can see the manipulator pop back to have the green going around here like it was before, even though the object is rotated. So what this is saying is we're now rotating based on the world axes, which never change, right? So even when we move an object around, you can see the manipulator itself is not changing. So we can always have the option, even if an object is rotated weird, to isolate based on the world axes. We just need to change that by holding down E and clicking and choosing this option. If we go back to object, you can see it still kept all those changes. And now, based on the object's rotation, we can see that the axes are moving all around, and so that's just something to keep in mind for later. So when we get into animation, this will be important, and I explain later in animation why that is important. So the other thing that just for myself I like to do is I like to only ever stay on the channel box unless I'm doing something very specific, because you can see this attribute editor here. You can see it says attribute editor right here on the side. It takes up a ton of room. There's just a lot of stuff going on and we don't need it. And so I like to keep the channel box open, because now we can see the values. We can zero them out. We can click and drag them and then hit 0 and zero everything out. This is way more useful when we're moving stuff around than the attribute editor. I'm also can slide that down to free up more space for the viewport. So similarly to the rotation axes being different, the move axes can also be different. So right now you can see, even though the object is rotated, the axes are pointing relative to the world. So if we hold down W, similarly like we held down E earlier, if we hold down W and left click, we get the same option, right? World object. So now we can see it's following the rotation. So it's following the object axes now. So that's just two different ways to manipulate the same object, based on its own axes or based on the world axes. So that's important. The final thing we're going to talk about is the scale. If you hit R, or you can go over here and click the scale button or the scale tool, and we can scale uniformly, and we can also scale on axes. And that's pretty straightforward. So we've gotten this far and we haven't moved around anything. How do we move around? So we have an object, now let's move around it. I want to zoom into it. How do I zoom in? I can mouse scroll, which I don't use that much, but the other option I have is to hold down Alt and right click and then drag my mouse. And you can see I'm doing the same thing. I'm zooming in and out. And this is why you need a 3-button mouse, because now if you click and hold the middle mouse button, I can pan around. And then if I, still holding Alt, if I left click, I can rotate around an object. So with the combination of these three things, I can do all sorts of moves and zoom in on things. And say I get way out here and I can't really see what I'm working on, I can click and drag and select the thing. I can select it from the outliner, and then I can hit F. So hit F and I jump back to the selection that I have, and now I'm free to move around again and do all that. You can also get to that option from the view menu here. I can go to View, Frame Selection. One other thing that's very helpful is look at selection. So for example, if we're over here and I'm rotating around, I'm not rotating around the object anymore. And why is that? That's because my center of interest is somewhere over here and I can't rotate around the object. So if I want to rotate around the object, I can go look at selection. So the position of the camera didn't change, but now it's just rotated looking at the selection. And now I can pivot around that object. So that's one way to help control your camera. And if your camera gets too crazy, you can always select it from here. Select camera, which is whatever camera this viewport is, we'll select it. You can also select it from the outliner because we know it's PERSP. You can see on here PRSP, PERSP, perspective. And you can see now we have all the values here, and we can just zero those out if things got too crazy. And of course, now we're inside the sphere because we're at 0 world space. And now you can see I'm rotating from some crazy point out there. I can select my object, hit F, and now I'm rotating around it and I'm back. So that's a quick introduction on how to move, scale, rotate, and move the camera around. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.